Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Irish Studies seminar. My name is Michael Lydon. I'm a lecturer here in the NUI Galway Centre of Irish Studies. It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome Dr. Craylin Ní Bhacáin. Dr. Ní Bhacáin is a lecturer at in communications at the University of Limerick. Her research explores women's intellectual, literary, and creative networks between 1880 and 1940, with ongoing projects on Teresa Deevy, Evelyn Gleeson, and the Doon Eamore Guild, and Alice Stopford Green. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Victorian Culture, Women's History Review, Era Ireland, Irish University Review, Studio Ireland's, Dublin Review of Books, and on the platform of the Modernist Archive of Publishing Project. Today's presentation on Roberts and Stopford Green is based on research from a collaborative project with Angus Mitchell on the networks of Alice Stopford Green. The responder today is Dr. Eva Rupo. Dr. Rupo is a graduate of Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Trinity College Dublin, and the National University of Ireland, Galway, where she's currently the Director of Academic Writing Centre, and teaches courses on Irish and European drama, James Joyce, and contemporary Irish fiction. She is the author of Ibsen and the Irish Revival from 2010 and the co-editor with Ross Dixon of Ibsen and Chekhov on the Irish Stage. Just for those of you unfamiliar with the proceedings of these Irish Studies seminar, we will have first the paper by Dr. Ní Bhacáin and then we will have the response by Dr. Rupo. If you have any questions, I'd ask you to please pop them in the Q&A and we will get to them towards the end of the paper of this hour as well. So again, it's my pleasure to act as chair for this afternoon's discussion and to welcome Dr. Ní Bhacáin for today's paper, Carnival, Time Among the Ibsenites, the 1893 collaboration of Elizabeth Robbins and Alice Stopford Green.
Thanks, Michael. I'd like to begin by thanking Nessa Cronin for the invitation to present and Ira Rupo for agreeing to act as respondent and for everyone who turned out virtually this afternoon. My paper today brings us back to the 1890s in London to explore an Irish dimension to some radical London networks. I have given Ira a much longer essay, but my presentation by necessity will just touch on a few key strands from this study. So I'd like to begin by introducing the Ibsen series that is at the center of my talk, and then to set it a little in context. Throughout my paper, I'll highlight some of the archival challenges in exploring women's friendships and collaborations. I'll talk about subscription funds as an important way of organizing, and then I will highlight some of the responses to this series. I want to move our attention onto the offstage activism, which supported the emerging new drama, and to think about the friendships and the networks which allowed women to make these important interventions. So over a 2-week period, So over a 2-week period in the summer of 1893, the American actor Elizabeth Robbins directed, starred in, and co-produced a series of Ibsen plays. The series launched on the 29th of May, beginning with 2 matinee performances on 2 consecutive days of Hedda Gabler, Rosmersholm and the Master Builder, and Brand, the 4th act. This was then followed by 6 consecutive evening performances, bringing the series to a close on the 10th of June. Robbins was supported by a small coterie that included her friend, the Irish historian and activist Alice Stopford Green. Now, the venture at the Opera Comique was an ambitious project presenting Ibsen's drama in a way that foregrounded his female protagonists and juxtaposed 4 distinct plays, allowing common themes and dramatic techniques to echo and resonate between each one. The format of the series, the plays chosen for performance, and the highbrow mode of patronage would suggest a desire to present the playwright's oeuvre in a way that would maximize engagement and publicity. That Stopford Green deployed her considerable reputation, her impressive personal network, and organizing skills in support of Robbins highlights the importance of women's friendship networks and collaborations. Elizabeth Robbins had first arrived in London in 1888, a young widow who knew few people and had limited financial means. Just 5 years later, her project to bring a personal repertoire of Ibsen plays to the stage was supported by some of the most significant political and literary figures of the day. And in a small way, I kind of want to look at how that evolution happened. So in the 1880s and 1890s, European theatre changed and evolved as new subscription-based non-commercial theatres emerged. So there was one in Berlin, there was one in Paris, and the Independent Theatre Society was founded in London in 1891 by a Dutch drama critic, Jacob Grain, to give, quote, special performances of plays which have a literary and artistic rather than a commercial value, end of quote. Across Europe, these ambitious theatre projects inspired a number of smaller subscription-based theatres, known collectively as the independent theatre movement. The success of these theatres resulted in a more widespread adoption of the new drama and a shift in how theatre was understood by intellectuals and critics. One advantage of the subscription-based model was that it allowed these theatres to avoid the censorship of the Lord Chamberlain's office. But significantly, the subscription system also protected managers against serious financial loss, and it also allowed women without a lot of, I suppose, means to become managers as well. So they were able to challenge the dominance of a theatrical aesthetic that was popular but depended on the actress as merely an attractive and one-dimensional spectacle. So those involved in the movement were conscious of its significance. And I have a quote here from George Bernard Shaw, which illustrates this when he says that the real history of drama in the last 10 years is not the history of the prosperous enterprises, and it goes on, but of the forlorn hopes led by Mr. Vernon, Mr. Charrington, Mr. Grain, Miss Adchurch, Miss Robbins, Miss Leah, Miss Farr, and the rest of the impossibilists. So here, I've just some images of the key players in this circle. And so this was the period when actors such as Janet Adchurch, Florence Farr, and Elizabeth Robbins directly challenged the male-dominated theatrical establishment through their choice of plays and their self-positioning as actress manageresses. In London, these women were a critical element in the success of the Ibsenite theatre. And together, these managers, writers, translators, directors, and actors created an alternative, experimental, and avant-garde theatre ecosystem. In her published and unpublished writings, Elizabeth Robbins chronicles the specific obstacles facing women who sought to bring the new drama to the stage, defying the establishment, frequently eliding or underplaying their own contributions in the form of translation, authorship, or financing. These women set up alternative modes of collaboration and put women at the heart of the emerging uncommercial theatre. Stopford Green's support for the new theatre movement preceded her involvement in the Ibsen series. Elizabeth Robbins includes her in a list of notable individuals who called to her third floor flat in Manchester Square Gardens in 1892, climbing, and she says, up and down those 74 steps for news from Norway, end of quote. Furthermore, Jacob Grine's wife and biographer recalls Stopford Green's early support for the Independent Theatre Society, noting that she had given the venture significant financial support. Remembered primarily as a historian and as an Irish nationalist, Alice Stopford Green's role in these avant-garde enterprises can seem anomalous. However, she was embedded in elite cultural, intellectual, and political networks throughout her years in London. Considered a figure of social importance and note, Stopford Green was described by one contemporary journalist as a modern woman of letters, quote, who was charming alike as a woman, a writer, and a hostess, blessed with grace, simplicity, and good looks, as well as ability of a high order, end of quote. Now, Robbins had not meant to settle in London. She stopped there for a week while en route to Norway. This social sojourn was to prove life-changing and ultimately resulted in Robbins spending most of the following 60 years there. According to her biographer, Angela John, a key impetus to stay was because during this transitory first week in London, quote, Elizabeth had been propelled into a succession of at-homes, meeting amongst others Oscar Wilde, end of quote. Thus, salon culture in Victorian London was immediately and immensely attractive to Robbins, who quickly developed a network of allies and admirers. She struggled once she was there, but some illustrious connections, such as with expatriate American actresses like Eleanor Calhoun and Genevieve Ward, were made through letters of introduction provided by her family back in the United States. These contacts helped with further introductions and provided an early support network, demonstrating the importance of homophily in creating opportunities for individuals when they are transposed to a new environment. Certainly, many of Robbins' closest friends in Britain were renowned and successful expatriate Americans. And this helps explain Robbins' evolution in those 5 years from widowed young emigre to respected Ibsen actress whose repertory project was supported by some of London's leading intellectuals, politicians, and saloniers. Robbins was naturally inclined to cooperation and shared ventures. In Theatre and Friendship, her memoir, she recalls that she and other actors in her circle, quote, found an intensity of happiness in working together at interesting stuff, end of quote. She collaborated in her translation work, her co-authorship of Alan's Wife with her close friend Florence Bell, and in producing theatre with William Archer, Marion Leah, and J.T. Grain. According to Leslie Ann Hill, women theatre makers such as Robbins needed the support of friends and allies in order to realise their artistic projects. Equally, such community and collaboration created the new drama movement in the 1890s. By the time she encountered Stopford Green in 1892, Robbins had emerged as a key figure in the introduction of Ibsen to London audiences, most famously for her collaboration with fellow American, the actress Marion Leah. So they undertook a joint management and produced Ibsen's Hedda Gabler in 1891. The first matinee took place on April 20th with luminaries such as Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, Eleanor Marx, George Bernard Shaw, and Henry James in attendance. Commercially, the production was very successful. After the initial run of 5 matinees, the play ran in the evening for 4 weeks along with Saturday matinees. And it has been estimated by Tracy C. Davis that more than 21,000 people attended the 38 performances. Quote, making Hedda Gabler easily the most significant production of what became known as the Ibsen year, end of quote. Robbins was instantly identified as an important figure in the cultural ferment of the 1890s. Now, I just want to briefly look or mention, I suppose, the archival challenges of trying to piece together the Ibsen series. Now, Robbins took extraordinary care with her papers, and her archive in the Fales Library is extensive. The fragmented nature of Stopford Green's archive is in striking contrast, and it contains no references to Robbins or their collaboration on the Ibsen series. Such contrasting archives highlight the challenges facing cultural historians and demonstrates the complexity of uncovering intellectual networks and women's alliances. By curating her archive, Robbins displayed foresight regarding the erasure of the translators, the cultural mediators, the producers, and the collaborative relationships that brought the new theatre to the stage. So the Robbins archive includes playbills, receipt for costumes, lists of furniture, and correspondence and notes regarding interpretations, translations, and collaboration. And while a theatrical production is ephemeral, the Elizabeth Robbins archive allows the researcher to visualize the details of the subscription-funded Ibsen series. Fragmentary traces of the series emerge in associated ephemera, including 2 circulars, administrative paperwork, proposed and final subscription lists, newspaper reviews, correspondence, and life writing. For example, the petty cash account detail the, quote, week's hire of a revolver, salt for snow, and candles for brand, end of quotes. So along with the ephemera in the Robbins archive, there are also these surviving letters from Stopford Green to Robbins. Now, what is notable about the early letters is how they reveal the mentoring advisory role which Stopford Green had adopted with her friend, helping her manage etiquette and navigate these London networks in which Stopford Green was much more established. Prior to the Ibsen series, Robbins shared a letter she had written to a mutual acquaintance, but Stopford Green advises against sending it, and this is the first quote there. So this letter is exceedingly honourable to you in feeling, but I rather doubt that this is the line to take in a letter of this kind, which I think would be certain to be seen by various people, end of quote. She closes the letter by hoping that Mrs. Bell could intervene on behalf of Robbins in the matter so that it could be resolved without any letter being sent at all. She also keeps Robbins informed of the popular chat amongst their network and their acquaintances. And the second and third are like, I suppose, relate to this. So the second one here is one in relation to Robbins's performance as Hilda in The Master Builder, where when she was in the middle of an initial 2-week run at the vaudeville. Meanwhile, I have been hearing the most excellent accounts, even from superior people who want to scoff, and in not a single case have I met with anything except real enthusiasm. I'm delighted to hear the audiences are keeping up so well and send you 1,000 congratulations. In this intense flurry of correspondence, Stopford Green alternately advises, informs, and supports Robbins at what must have been a very intense and vulnerable period for her. She keeps Robbins abreast of pertinent gossip, and she acts as a sponsor in promoting her interests. And as noted by Mary, such gossip, quote, is a form of private information that symbolizes intimacy and facilitates the forging of new intimate relationships, end of quote. And through sharing these stories and all this information, Stopford Green was deepening her relationship with Robbins, and her letters demonstrate her emotional engagement and concern. Now, subscription lists were a central and frequently overlooked aspect of public culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So they were used to fund schools, societies, private printing presses, political projects, and independent theatres. Now, arguing that subscription schemes created a foundation for the development of both theatre, audiences, and repertoire in the modern period, Matthew Franks notes that, quote, private subscription schemes appeal to coteries, while public subscription schemes appeal to crowds, end of quote. And in the case of the Ibsen series, the administration of this private subscription fund represented a collaboration between 3 close supporters of Robbins and their distinct but overlapping coteries. So you have Alice Stopford Green, Sir Frederick Pollock, and they're the 2 trustees, and J.T. Grain acted as the managing secretary of the fund. And a subscription event like this brought together a network in a temporary theatrical space. And it also opened up the series to a broader public who could buy tickets. And so the Ibsen series departed from the usual format in that it presented a series of plays by one dramatist over a fortnight. And constituting an experimental and ephemeral coterie, the Ibsen series subscribers were supporting an alternative theatrical model, an avant-garde repertoire, and the ambitious project by the now renowned Elizabeth Robbins. Now, I suppose to start with the planning, the first planning meeting of interested parties was held at Stopford Green's home on the 13th of April, 1893. Now, Robbins was away in Yorkshire for this initial meeting. She was recuperating after the extended run of The Master Builder at the home of her friend Florence Bell. And her father had also died at the beginning of April. So she was, and she had been suffering from exhaustion. And at this meeting, it was estimated that 10 or 12 performances would cost around 500 guineas. They issued a prospectus inviting 105 guinea subscribers and announcing Stopford Green and Pollock as the trustees. Now, Robbins returned to London for the second organising meeting, which she attended with Alice, and that was hosted by Edward and Dorothy Gray at the House of Commons. Other guests that evening included Asquith, Richard Haldane, and Alfred Milner. So, I mean, if you kind of think about those names. And the final details of the fund were quickly worked out at this second meeting. So subscribers would be entitled to 2 stalls for each of the 3 plays performed, but only 30 of the guarantors were entitled to stalls for the first performances of each play. The estimated expenses included the salaries of Robbins and Mr. Waring of £25 a week. And beyond their salaries, they were to receive no profit until each guarantor had been paid off. Now, private subscription funds were carefully curated, and they delineated a particular network at a moment in time. Now, the subscribers for the Ibsen series were targeted by Stopford Green and her co-organisers. Within the Robbins archive, there is a list of, quote, addresses of people to whom letters are to be sent, end of quote. And the final subscription list for the Ibsen series consisted in a total of 104 names, and this divided equally between 52 women and 52 men. And this gender equality is suggestive and surely reflects the gender politics of the organisers. From the list of addresses, it can be gleaned that over 90% were located within central London, and most of these within the boroughs of Westminster and Kensington. And this demonstrates the importance of spatial proximity in these metropolitan cultural networks. Now, while geographical proximity was important, there were other decisive factors in the constituting of these ephemeral coteries. So these social links were also, in this case, formed and sustained within an elite cultural and political milieu. So around 75 people on the list are readily identifiable and have accessible profiles with their names appearing in either the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography or through straightforward internet searches. And by dividing these names up into groups, it is possible to see that they fit neatly, or roughly, I should say, into 10 distinguishable categories. So you have philanthropic, suffragist women, salon connections, artists, writers and actors, scholars, politician, Cambridge apostles, Irish connections, legal administrators, publishers, critics and journalists. And for a project, I suppose, like the Ibsen series, a trustee like Stopford Green was critically important in ensuring its success. She was a powerful social broker, linking disparate groups and coteries. And according to sociologist Ronald Burt, such brokers have high social capital, and they are critically important in social networks as information, ideas, and opportunities flow through them. The broker's position is sustained through their personal credibility, flexibility, and amiability, and is underpinned by their regular investment in relationships spanning several groups or discrete networks. In that sense, not everyone can bridge or mediate between coteries, as they lack the social, intellectual, or cultural capital to do so. From this perspective, the contribution of Stopford Green is clearly identifiable. Through family and marriage, she was connected to Gladstonian liberals and eminent historians. Through her own scholarship, she knew publishers, critics, and scholar diplomats. Her Irish background embedded her in that diasporic network in London, and her metropolitan salon hosted aesthetes, arts and crafts proselytizers, philanthropic women, and leading politicians. In a cultural context where subscription projects were an engine of activism and achievement, weak ties, as they're described, and social brokers were powerfully influential. And in one letter, Stopford Green reveals the work she was undertaking to secure support for the series. And I have this quote here: 38 subscriptions, and I hope to get 2 more tonight. And a great many of those who are here today say that now that they have definite information, they can begin to collect other subscribers. Significant too is how each subscription process could energize latent or invisible ties within the network, so that these individuals could connect or share an imagined camaraderie through their involvement or attendance at the event. Subscribers fund the event, and then the event itself buttresses and makes visible the weak ties within the network. In this context, individuals such as Stopford Green were critical, acting as broker, disseminating ideas and connecting coteries. So the Ibsen series lacked a company of actors and an obvious venue. As I mentioned, the venue they eventually found was the Opera Comique, a theatre located in London's West End. So yeah, it was kind of in that sense, kind of interesting. And Stopford Green's correspondence reveals weeks of busy planning and preparations, ensuring props were secured, the buying of dresses, hiring of carpenters, clearing of copyright, and purchasing advertising space in the newspapers. And and careful attention is evident in the printing of posters and in the detail. I love this detail in the printer's invoice, noting that the circulars would be printed using green ink on primrose colored paper. And it's just worth, I suppose, remembering that, you know, Robbins goes on to be involved firstly in the founding of the Actresses Franchise League, but also in writing Votes for Women and The Convert. So subscription societies were not just private clubs or ephemeral funding networks. They cultivated a wider audience and they courted publicity. So indeed, by financing the production of such plays and by seeking publicity through both informal communication channels and through formal advertising, these organizers created events that became newsworthy, generating controversy and reviews within newspapers. Now, informal promotion happens through correspondence, through gossip and salon conversations. Formal advertising was included in the budget. And the Robbins archives includes invoices and receipts for 400 copies of the preliminary announcement flyer, further promotional circulars, several hundred posters, ticket books, and other production-specific ephemera. Alice Stopford Green is on many of these, and there's invoices from Frank Marshall, who was an advertising agent, including details of advertising costs for the following newspapers: The Times, The Telegraph, Globe, Evening News, Echo, Standard, Morning Post, Daily Chronicle. The Marshall Agency also charged £9 for, quote, supplying 10 sandwich men for the opera comique Ibsen plays for 12 days. So the Ibsen series was widely reviewed. And I realize I'm covering a lot of ground here, but there's a lot going on. And so over a period of 5 weeks from late May to the beginning of July, these reviews appeared, with some newspapers publishing more than one review of the series. Now, I don't have time to review the coverage, but suffice to say, and you can see from this list here from my slide, it was extensive and highlights the newsworthiness of the series. And the reviews that accompanied this series were generally positive, but there were notable exceptions. I mean, I get my title, Carnival Time Among the Ibsenites, from a very critical review by Clement Scott, the Telegraph critic. So, but it was kind of interesting because this creates a sense that an important event had occurred, and it prompted kind of and that it was prompting this kind of fiery debate on the new drama. And the impact was far greater than immediate audiences. For example, the Ibsen series was reviewed knowledgeably in the London dailies, but also in the Scottish papers, such as the Edinburgh Evening Dispatch, the Aberdeen Free Press, and the Scotsman. And the committee's ambition and the audience in attendance was noted, for example, in this one by a reviewer for the Aberdeen Free Press. The audience, and I'm quoting now, the audiences that gathered at these performances were unmistakably Ibsenite. They were very much in earnest, consistent largely of intelligent-looking people of all social grades. Many of them were equipped with the text of the plays produced. End of quote. Now, audience members clutching published plays could recognize fellow aficionados and experience Ibsen in this kind of mutual knowledge and appreciation. And being in such an audience was itself a creative and defining act. That Ibsen's drama was often conflated with the emergence of the new woman was cause for some critics, of course, to express their hostility. And one contemptuous reviewer, which I have quoted just a brief bit here, in the Man of the New World, commented that, quote, the audience were composed of ladies in the proportion of 10 to 1 man, end of quote. And foregrounding production and reception, Susan Barstow notes the transformative effect. I mean, she's a lovely essay on matinee audiences in the 1890s, but she said that they were dominated by women, I'm quoting now, as spectators, actresses, and dramatic protagonists, providing a space for the observation and critique of stage femininity, end of quote. Now, after the series, the subscribers held a presentation for Robbins. I won't get into it now, but it was a ceremonial event where they gave the profits that were made, they had given back to they distributed to the guarantors, and then they decided to come together and they would buy the silver tea set for Robbins. And it was kind of interesting. I mean, Henry James talks about, I can briefly quote it. He said, I've been notified of where you will be on Sunday afternoon and hope to squeeze a sympathetic presence into the jubilant mass. And what you see there is that this kind of event will allow the network to become visible to contributors. You know, they'll all congregate together, and it creates this kind of opportunity for further sociability and networking. And anyway, I won't go into the details of that there, but I suppose I'll come to a conclusion. So I'm going to conclude with these two, I think, lovely quotes, one from Henry James. And I should say that a lot of the information on the Robbins Stopford Green collaboration and friendship comes through these kind of ancillary correspondences. And this one here, so he said, you know, your account of Mrs. Green's ministrations brings tears to my eyes. Brava, as we say here, Mrs. Green, brava, everyone. Please don't be any more silent than sounds well. And believe me, dear Miss Robbins, yours always. And the second, I suppose, is even more important. And it's appears towards the end of Theatre and Friendship, which was published after Stopford Green's death and nearly 40 years after the Ibsen series itself. And in it, Robbins singles out the Ibsen series in 1893 as an innovation in terms of its format and its organization. And she also positions it as the precursor to the New Century Theatre, a repertory theatre project that she developed in 1897 with William Archer and others. And she says that first of all, the series of Ibsen plays, the series called into existence by outside initiation and the first to be financed by funds from an outside group made up of playgoers. One effect of that first series was to attract to this small form of small theatrical enterprise a surprising amount of active support. By active, I mean in terms other than money, although money was subscribed to. Those early backers, Mrs. J.R. Green as convener and first guarantor. So the 1893 Ibsen series enabled both ticketed matinee audiences and wealthier patrons of the subscription fund to congregate as a collective and to contemplate these complex female protagonists. My paper today reveals, I hope, the importance of friendship and social networks in driving these cultural projects and in instigating a public debate on the merits of the new drama. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Aquarian, for a fascinating paper. We'll jump straight into the response. Ira, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm just turning on my video.
Perfect.
For some reason,
Okay.
it's not turning on. Sorry. Here it is.
No problem.
Yeah, here. So, thank you so much for this, Quaylen. That was, I was absolutely fascinated to hear it, and I have read a version of this paper before, and I very much enjoyed seeing all the materials as well that you have presented. It is a fascinating subject. It is an interesting subject, and one that's very close to my heart. I really like the fact that you said that your paper highlights the importance of female friendship, and I suppose the role of those subscription funds. You mention in your paper that it is the nature of theatre, obviously, it is ephemeral, and it's only through those minute attention that historians, cultural historians such as you, can give those minute details, that we can gather impressions of performances long gone. And my first impression of this paper is precisely that, is the ephemeral nature, if you like, of friendships, whether female or otherwise, and the ephemeral nature of social gatherings and the life that has long since passed, that has been so painstakingly, so accurately, with such precise and hard work reconstructed here, through receipts and through tiny mentions in various people's letters, giving us a picture of a particular friendship, of particular social networks, gossip, all those things. I especially liked the slide where we got to see all the members of a particular party and what it meant for them to attend it and what it meant for them to be part of that fund. And I thought, in this regard, I'm thinking of Juliana D'Amico's article that was published in 2014, where D'Amico actually presented 6 points on the comparative reception of Ibsen, and he issued what he himself called a clarion call to Ibsen scholars to shift the way, I suppose, we talk about Ibsen's reception and by extension about other authors' international reception. And I can quote from this article because I think it very much relates to your paper. So D'Amico writes, although a considerable number of studies on the reception of Ibsen in European and non-European countries have been published in the last 40 years, attempts at putting local receptions into a broader comparative framework have been quite rare. In most cases, Ibsen scholars have concentrated on the internal dynamics of local receptions, with occasional references to the differences arising between Ibsen's original horizon of expectations and that of the new audience. in other words, there wasn't enough attention, I suppose, given to these minute details, to the various aspects within the local communities that affect a playwright's reception, and also to the international aspect of those networks. Danica specifically mentions the role that is occupied not only by translators and not only by the book market, and I suppose not only by theatre directors and actors, but also by what he calls middlemen, people who are enabled through perhaps being fortunate enough to have been born into wealth, and through their interest in a particular playwright, in Ibsen, to further the cause of that playwright and to help actors, translators, theatre managers. And certainly the case of Alice Stopford Green is interesting because she is such a middle person without whom perhaps this fabulous 1893 series might not have happened. So that's very, very interesting, and indeed very interesting to see exactly what it means. Like, in terms of this network, I think your paper certainly highlighted not only the role that those networks play, but also what it means, what it might have meant to be part of this network. In what way it created the case for Elizabeth Robins to be that beloved person of the higher society. In what sense it enabled Ibsen to be that beloved playwright of the higher society. Very, very interesting what it means that by virtue of exchanging money, those people, at least if I understood it correctly, essentially became co-conspirators. They became part of the of Ibsen's cause in England, and your paper makes it situates it in a wider context. I mean, you quote from Clement Scott, whose, I think, main claim to fame is being this vociferous opponent of Ibsenism and all things Ibsenite. And what does it mean for those people to have parted with their money in order to become Ibsenites, in order to be on that side of history, on that side of the small part of history, which is the history of drama. So the other things that I think are interesting in this paper is how many gaps there exist in our, the closer we get to history, whether it is a theatrical performance, whether it is the life of those people, the more we understand how much has slipped away. And the comparison of the two archives is certainly a testament to that. Alice Stopford Green's archive does not contain any references to this spectacular occasion which she enabled. You mentioned as well that the letters between the two women are not always very, do not always contain a lot of information because they got to speak to each other on a daily basis. And yet it gives hints of what might have been, of the kind of friendship or friendships that those networks would have included, that might have been perhaps different from the kind of friendships that we may cultivate now. Perhaps their nature was more intimate. Perhaps there was an assumption that it's natural for one to recover not in her home but in a friend's house, or then to spend large amounts of time in her friend's care, in her friend's house. There is a sense there of a different type of a relationship, a different type of friendship that's only intimated through those snippets of information. And I found it as fascinating as, I suppose, reading Ibsen's play, one of Ibsen's plays, and thinking about all the subtext and all the things existing between the lines, and thinking as well of the audience and how they would have understood those plays at the time. Certainly when you read, the Brothers Karamazov, when you read Ibsen's Hedda Gabler, there is a sense that time does not apply. you're on level foot with the author. You understand everything they have to say. You might understand it better than the original audience. And at the same time, you do not know how close you are to that original audience. You quote in your paper, or you mention in your paper, that well-known article, Hedda is All of Us, late Victorian Women at the Matinee, by Susan Barstow. And there's a quote there, which has become the title, that Hedda is all of us, which was something spoken by one of the members of the audience. Hedda is all of us. And when I was listening to your paper, I kept thinking about that. To what extent was Hedda all of them? Why was Hedda all of them? After all, Hedda Gabler seems to celebrate, or seems to highlight rather than celebrate, almost the very opposite of what of the life of the people who brought those plays on stage. Where in the story of Alice Stopford Green and Elizabeth Robinson, you find real female friendship, real devoted friendship. In Hedda, there is a horrible, perverted relationship between two women that ranges from bullying to exploitation to jealousy. If in the case of Alice Stopford Green and Elizabeth Robinson, you have a devotion to the cause, in Hedda, you find something far darker, far mysterious. And there is something about that play that leaves people, I suppose, still leaves people in shock. Why does she kill herself at the end? Is it an act of feminism as defiant, as clear as Elizabeth Robinson's beautiful staging of these plays? Or is it again something darker, something that is hard to fathom? So, I mean, Hedda Gabler itself is not obviously part of that paper. It is in the background. It is in the gaps. And this is why I found it so interesting. I found how your paper highlights those aspects of the theatrical life, of cultural life, that we don't normally see, being only able to see the text that is left behind. But the real mystery, I think, left behind after listening to your paper is in that relationship between the audiences and the actors and the theatre managers and the middlemen, and that strange text, accessible to us, but accessible to us perhaps in a different way than it was to those people. So I thank you very, very much for that experience, and I'm very excited to see what the audience members will have to say, and to hear your response to their questions. And I'm looking forward to that. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you, Nessa, for inviting me. And thank you again for your paper.
Thank you, Ira. Just a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A, and we'll get to that in a few moments. But first, we can give the platform back to Grayling.
So I'm struggling with technology here. Yeah, I'd like to thank Ira for that really thoughtful response, and for her own work, which is really has so carefully reconstructed that Ibsen influence on the Irish revival. And I think, I mean, there's a few things there that I suppose I didn't get to go into in my presentation, but I kind of highlighted or flagged in the longer paper. And that's in some ways that, you know, there is still kind of a lot of mystery, even in all of it. Like, so there is this kind of hint that, you know, that I suppose the relationship between Robbins and Stopford Green is very intense in that period. And Henry James kind of says that, you know, it's the talk of the town at one point, and he goes to visit them. I mean, I think Stopford Green was very compassionate towards Robbins at this point, because she kind of recognized the exhaustion of Robbins. And so 2 days after the Ibsen series, Robbins, who really had very little money, started performing in another show. And Stopford Green had rented a house in Ireland to bring Robbins to Ireland for that summer. And because Robbins got this job, she basically changed her plans, rented a cottage for them on Wilmington Common, and stayed there, basically looking after Robbins and trying to help her recuperate that summer. Which is kind of really interesting. And I suppose another thing I'd like to mention, which I didn't get to put in the presentation, is that their friendship continues. Like I think it's kind of interesting that, Stopford Green's last letter to Robbins is the year before she dies in 1928. And, at this point, Stopford Green is a senator in the new Free State. She's very old. She's just been made an honorary doctor of letters. It's a very fond kind of letter, and you kind of see how these friendships waned and were so kind of powerful at the same time and so supportive. Yeah, I don't know, does anyone have any questions? I suppose another thing that was kind of interesting was that I think that Ira mentioned, what does it mean to become part of the Ibsen movement? And I think that's actually a really important question that I suppose I was thinking about this subscription fund and what does it actually mean? I mean, it's this extraordinary. I mean, and again, I didn't show the full table, and I haven't actually quite figured out how to present it as of yet. But like people like Mae Morris are there. I mean, it's got such a broad range of people, but in a way, I think that subscription fund, what it tells us, when you subscribe to something, in the same way when Stopford Green gave funding to the Independent Theatre Society of J.T. Grain, that kind of commitment does, I suppose, represent something, because you do become part of something much bigger. And so I think that kind of the idea of the subscription fund in itself, and it's something that becomes very, very popular in the years afterwards in different, I mean, you see it. I mean, I'm also working on the Doonemer Press, but they have a subscription fund. Everyone has subscribers. And yeah, I suppose that's, I think, kind of something that really more could be kind of made of how those subscription funds represent these kind of networks.
I was thinking as well, Llewellyn, I was thinking that there's obviously the Irish dimension that you highlighted in your paper, and it's a peculiar Irish dimension because Stopford Green certainly does not act as, representative of the Irish people and their interest in Ibsen. She's a person living in London. She's part of the of that society, of several circles, including the Irish one. And that is amusing because it complicates the question of reception. Certainly when I was working on the reception of Ibsen in Ireland, I found it very confusing because most of the people that I was interested in, such as, for example, Oscar Wilde or Yeats, they're not in Ireland when I want them to be. They're in England. So it does, I think, complicate in general the question of international reception. That people have moved.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think, the Irish in London is a really interesting story at that time. But I also think, we tend to see a lot of what's going on now through that kind of nexus of Yeats. And someone like Green doesn't really, I mean, and if you asked, I suppose a lot of people that would know a little about Green, they just wouldn't expect to see her in this kind of role. She has been read in this kind of prism. I go back to the R.B. MacDougall of, a passionate historian. And yet, and she's interesting because, in 1889, she signs that appeal against suffrage, and yet, and she's completely transformed her views, say by 1915, when she writes a preface where she talks about suffrage as this kind of really important kind of movement for, in a general sense. So you kind of, I guess, but I think that's right. I think, we kind of, again, look at, we can kind of see that because I suppose of what happened subsequently, that Irish dimension in London doesn't get kind of explored in quite the same way. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've been thinking about it.
Thank you both. We've just some questions coming through. If it's okay, I might just read them out. If that's okay with you, Quaileen?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. So the first question is from Mark Quigley. Mark asks, wonderful paper, Quaileen, that covered so much ground. I was struck by your emphasis on the extensive effort that went into publicizing the performances and ways in which the codees itself would generate publicity. All of that suggests a very sophisticated and even sly understanding of the nature of framing public discourse. Giving the subject of Ibsen's plays and the response from some of the reviewers to underscore the political significance of the effort. To what degree do you think the different strategies of publicity overlapped with some of the strategies of the suffragettes and our more explicitly political activist movements of the era?
Yeah, that's a great
A lot to
question.
digest.
Yeah, but it's a great question, and I'll tell you,
Absolutely.
there's a lot going on here that I think is absolutely right. I mean, firstly, I think if Robbins and afterwards, say, when there was the coronation march for suffrage in 19 I can't remember I think it might be in 1911, but Elizabeth Robbins wanted the procession to be led by a woman dressed as Hedda Gabler. And you have the purple and the green, and you have this sense. I think one of the things is it's almost like a laboratory of where they're kind of trying to, that's what I'm saying. I mean, Stopford Green goes on to have lots of really interesting and important subscription funds. She runs everything through subscription. The African Society, she starts raising money to run guns into Ireland. Everything is through subscription funds. And I think as well, they really, I mean, it is, I think, and I think it's underestimated just how important, like Matthew Franks has an interesting book, but he talks about how the subscription theatre, these kind of independent theatre, they were much more likely to enter the canon subsequently. These plays that came through the independent theatre that were kind of promoted by subscribers. So what you have is this sense that they kind of understood how publicity works, and they understood how to create a discussion around an event. Now they both went, I mean, and that's what's interesting about it, both Stopford Green and Robbins, is they both become really political activists in different ways. And they both, I think, really understood. They also understood the framing. I mean, one of the things, again, I couldn't really get into it here, but like Robbins co-writes with Florence Bell, Alan's wife, and it's 30 years later before J.T. Grain, who produced it for them. I mean, they acted in it, or Robbins acted in it, before they admit that they wrote it. It was the 1920s. So, they also understood what negative publicity was and what gossip was dangerous. So that was really interesting too, I think. But it's a really interesting question, because I think absolutely they started framing what they were doing. I hope that answers that, or I mean, I can come back to it.
Thank you, Mark, for that, and thank you, Quaileen, for response. Just to echo a point by Maureen O'Connor here, a great paper and some excellent questions. Another excellent question from Julia Ann Stevens, who asks, well, it says, first, initially, a most interesting paper and response. Thank you. Does Robbins use American links? Do the American papers also respond to this work? Are there subscribers in the US?
Yeah, in this instance, there aren't, but it's a great question, because and the more I kind of delve into this world of Elizabeth Robbins, the more fascinated I become, because firstly, this series doesn't get a lot of attention anyway. And I could say, gosh, that's desperate and it's surprising, but Robbins is life was just so filled. I mean, 1893 itself, she finishes The Master Builder, which she co-translated. She brings to the stage in an independent production. Then she goes into the series. Then she has to make some money, and she works in this commercial kind of theatre production. And then she starts, and Alan's Wife is produced as well in the meantime. You know, her. So you have a kind of an extraordinary busyness, but there isn't subscribers, and it doesn't seem to be, certainly I haven't seen any references in the American papers. But what I would say is that she uses this knowledge later when she helps the Pankhursts when they go to America in the early 20th century, and she sets it up. Her brother's wife is a very important suffragette there, and they again see how they can kind of, I suppose, use the publicity, and she kind of creates a stir. She understands how publicity works at that point. So it's a great question. So not so much for the series, but later I think she starts bringing in that American dimension. And she goes back and forth from America 60 times in her life, Elizabeth Robbins. But she never lives there again after her week stop off in London.
Any more questions? Please feel free to pop it in there. Ira, do you want to make any final questions or remarks, or?
Not at this stage. I'm sure
Okay,
I'll probably think of
very
something
good.
as soon as we're done.
Absolutely.
I thought it
Just
was. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
sorry, just a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions, obviously Craylene has her email put up here as well, and her Twitter handle also. So just to make you aware, we can follow the conversation up on.
Yeah, please do. And also, I suppose I'd just like to add, I mean, one of the reasons I've kind of, I'm part of this Irish Women's Writing Network, but, we have been we had a symposium recently on women's friendship and collaborations and networks. And I think it really does that prism, when you turn that prism onto this kind of material, it's really interesting what emerges. So I just think that look at kind of women's kind of friendship and how I suppose the challenges for the cultural historian are just kind of, I suppose, really interesting. But also I think digitization, it helps massively in terms of trying to access some of this stuff now.
We just have one more question from Catherine Lang. Catherine writes, thank you, creating a fascinating paper. There was a reference to a presentation for Elizabeth Robbins hosted by Mrs. W.K. Clifford, if I remember correctly. Can you tell us more about her?
I can tell you bits. So Mrs. Clifford is very involved in the Ibsen series, and it's at her house that they have this presentation of the silver tea service, which has gone missing. But Clifford was also involved in helping with production details, like with getting the dress, how, I suppose, it's just some of the kind of organizing of the furniture for the opera comique. But she is someone that has a profile. I do have more information. There's just so many people, but she is involved in that theatrical world, and there is a profile for her, I think, in the Dictionary of National Biography. So she was, yeah, I mean, I'll follow up, Catherine, with some information on Clifford. I have some, not at the top of my, not at my fingertips though. But I do think that silver service is kind of interesting though, that because they made us a profit. They made a profit on the Ibsen series, which is no small achievement. And and again, Ger Duckworth, who is the half brother of Virginia Woolf, he's involved at this point in sending out the monies to the different subscribers. And then they have this idea that, we'll give her a silver tea service, and they write to everybody, and poor Oscar Wilde has very little money at this point, and he says, I can only give you 3 shillings, but please put my name down. And they all basically give the money back, and they buy this silver tea service for Robbins, and they have this kind of party at Mrs. Clifford's house, where they make the presentation. And again, I thought it was very interesting that it kind of brought this subscription list together really for the first time. And of course, Henry James writes that note where he says he really hopes he can be there, but that he's got a bit of a cold. So, I mean, yeah, it's kind of I think a kind of an interesting addendum to to the series.
Thank you very much, Quaileen. It would be wonderful if we could all be together now and enjoy some tea with a nice tea set. But unfortunately, the next time you make your way towards Galway, hopefully it'll be within the live setting. We've just some more questions. Actually, just noticed there's two more questions, two more comments here. From Deirdre Brady, just saying fascinating. Many thanks, and Catherine responded saying thank you very much. So if we've no more questions, again, I'd like to express my gratitude to Quaileen for today's paper, and to Ira, of course, for a fascinating response again. Should anyone have any questions, please feel free, obviously, to follow up with Quaileen. And we look forward to some future Irish Studies seminars and seeing many of you here again. Many thanks.
Yeah, thanks a million. Thanks, Ira, and thanks, Michael.
Thank you so much, both.